Hello and welcome. In this episode of Not Just Ads with our guest Ben Walmsley, the Sun Managing Director and former News UK Commercial Director, we will touch many hot topics in the strategy of a media brand. From internal alignment to reducing the ad load on the page and embracing the less is more mantra, from how News UK created the role of head of consent and their new holistic approach to the topic, to how to develop an entrepreneurial culture across a big international media group. Last but not least, we will hear from Ben how they stopped hosting external content recommendation widgets on their pages and replaced it with their own content recirculation engine. Plenty of stuff to keep anybody working in the industry glued to the screen. Enjoy! Hi Ben, welcome to Not Just Ads. I've been waiting for so long to have you here because I used to work at News UK. It's a great company. It's a big corporation, huge media group, and I've noticed since you joined in 2016, there are being changes. So there are things that one would associate with slimmer, more flexible, faster companies. What happened? Tell us how you approach it and the story so far.
Yeah, good morning. Thank you for having me first, Alessandro. It's an honor to be here talking to you
It's a
today.
pleasure.
I joined News UK in May of 2016. And so there was a lot of change in the company at that time. You know, Rebecca Brooks had quite recently rejoined the company as CEO. The company's going through a lot of change and predominantly digital change. I think, Rebecca came back with this very clear vision and mandate to really transform the company into being a digital company. And that wasn't always the case before, before I think I joined. And so I came in this wave of change that was happening across News UK. And we were given a lot of freedom at that time. I think the brief was to, or certainly my brief was to build a commercial digital footprint for News UK, and we had a lot of freedom to experiment in doing that. So we started by looking at the sites. The Sun in particular wasn't really built for an ad monetization model because, of course, it had the paywall before, and as did the Times, both went behind the paywall in 2010, 2011, and then in November 2015, the Sun paywall had come down. So that gave us a really blank canvas to think about the change that we wanted to put in place, and that was a really exciting and quite daunting brief at times, but we did a lot quite quickly, and I think it started with the culture that we'd created in the team, and it's not just, of course, the digital commercial team, but it was the culture that was prevalent in the wider business. Keith Poole had joined as digital editor of the Sun, and he is also somebody who's very good at driving change, very entrepreneurial in his approach. So, thinking from that perspective, we changed, certainly the commercial side, we changed the profile of the team. So we brought in a lot of different profiles of individual coming from different organizations, and that gave a freedom of thinking. That digital team was quite different, I suppose, to the rest of the News UK business, and we were able to attract people in because they were quite excited about being part of this wave of change. And then we launched a lot of products quite quickly within that team. So commercial products that didn't exist before. And I think the biggest part of that was a different approach to data. And News UK had sat on many data assets for decades in some cases. But clearly we recognised that was a real opportunity. So the initial task for that team was piecing together a lot of the different data assets and thinking how we could use that to fuel the digital change. And that was relevant to both the commercial side of the business, and so that really gave rise to Nucleus, which is now the first party data platform which runs across the company and is used for commercial purposes, but also other parts of the business. And then that team came in and launched a lot of things very quickly and grew very quickly. So it went from a team of about 15 people working on the commercial digital business to 50 in a couple of years. And during that time, launched a lot of products and really, I suppose, got on the front foot with changing the perception of News UK within the industry to really being a digital innovator. And I think we had some successes and industry recognition in doing that. And then I suppose the other part of that is looking at the partnerships and the launches that we were able to be a part of in that time. So I think we look at Ozone, Octave, the Fifth. We also during that time period we acquired the Wireless Group and TalkSport and the broadcast businesses. So that gave us a whole new load of capability to work.
Can I interrupt you for a second? Sorry. For those that are not from the UK and don't know in detail what these brands are, well, they will probably know about Ozone, Octave, the Fifth, Times Radio. Could you briefly describe them, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so the fifth came from within our team at that point. So the Fifth is an influencer marketing agency, and I think this is you talk about change and something you might associate with a slimmer and more dynamic organization. The company has always been very willing to invest in good ideas, and Ollie Lewis, who was the strategic development director at the time in that digital team, came up with the idea of an influencer agency. And that isn't something typically you might associate with as you say, a large news organization. So he had that idea and pitched it to the leadership team. And because it's a very compelling pitch, and there was an opportunity that was recognised at the time, the company chose to invest in that idea. And Ollie is now running that business as CEO, and it's been established for many years now.
Well, I've been working with Ollie Lewis. I know him well, and I keep saying what he has done within a huge media group like News UK. So starting with an idea, pitching the idea, creating basically a startup within News Corp and News UK has been really an amazing journey, and I'm so glad that it's having success with it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's now an international brand. They've presence in the US. So yeah, Ollie's had a very clear vision of what he wanted the company to be, and I think it's testament to the entrepreneurialism, the spirit of entrepreneurialism that exists within News UK, that they're willing to hear people out and invest in talent, invest in a good idea that comes from within the business.
But it's not the only story of there are other stories of people that spearheaded different areas, right?
Yeah, that's right. Octave is another one you mentioned. So Octave, an audio exchange. So again, it's an idea that came from within the business. We've moved. Also, Deepan, who I think
that I work with as well. Yes.
So he again was part of that digital team. Had a hand in the creation of Octave, which was this digital audio business, an audio exchange, and a joint venture with Bauer. And that's again, that's now a very established business. And Deepan went from that team to be operations director within Octave. So another idea, another example of innovation. I think that was slightly different because it was a joint venture. But again, so many macro changes in the industry. It's time that publishers collaborate more effectively, and that's a really good example of it. And then you also mentioned Ozone, which is I guess a more complex collaboration between publishers, and that's something we were involved in from the very early stages, and came out. There were discussions before that about collaboration within the publishing industry, fairly well publicized. A project that was known as Rio, and then Juno. Maybe it was the other way around. I can't remember. The name kept leaking and was getting changed, but it started as the premise of a sales house for news. perhaps was a bit too ambitious, or rather unclear as to what exactly the value creation was. And I think from the embers of those discussions, when publishers started to pull out of that, then Ozone was born, and a few of us, as in particular, then it was the Guardian and News UK, and then Telegraph, and subsequently Reach, who came together to form Ozone. And that's been again, I think is a really good example of an entrepreneurial spirit, a willingness to see things differently, a willingness to collaborate with traditional competitors. And we learned a lot from that journey. But as you'll no doubt be aware, that's running now as a very successful enterprise, great leadership team in place, and we're really optimistic about the future for that business, and proud to have been there from the start.
And thank you. This is a great initial overview, and I have a few topics that I would like to deep dive into. And actually, I thought of a list of topics, but you mentioned something very, very interesting. So I'll change my order, and I'll start with the sun. Usually in the industry, when I talk to clients, to other media businesses, the challenge is, okay, how do you go from an ad funded model to a subscription model, or a hybrid, let's say, model? With the Sun, you did exactly the opposite. So the paywall came down and you had to reinvent the ad approach. Your situation was very peculiar. So you actually reduced the ad load and increased the quality of the ads. Can you tell us more about this, please?
Yes, so that's something that's really been a focus for us in the last 2 to 3 years, and I think up to then the prevailing wisdom, perhaps I shouldn't call it that, but the economics of publishing was such that the people felt that you just put as many ads on the page as you could realistically get away with, and we see lots of that still happening in the publishing industry, and the focus is not just about what you see on the page, should really be about what happens behind the page. So when we talk about ad load, I think certainly what you don't see is as important as what you do see on the page. And it was clear to us that we didn't want to degrade the user experience by adding more ads on, and particularly I think this has become in sharper focus over the last 2-3 years, because we've seen such significant changes to referral traffic, search and social referral traffic, and that's had a major impact. But also advertisers have started to really assess the quality of ads more so than they perhaps did in the past, and so the economics aren't as clear cut where more ads equals more money. So it's fairly easy to say, let's just take ads off the page and reduce the amount of JavaScript that's being executed. But in reality, it's actually pretty hard to do. So we became very focused on this. And I think one of the first major things we did was took content recommendation off the bottom of the page. So we, for many years, and particularly when we, like as you say, we were rebuilding the model from being behind a paywall, one of the partnerships we would have is always a content recommendation partner at the bottom of the page. But we became quite uncomfortable with it because it was degrading the user experience. Often, relatively poor quality, sometimes even MFA type experiences at the bottom of the page, and that's not really where you want to be sending your most engaged audience to, who have read the article all the way to the bottom of the page. And frankly, we felt that there must be a better way. So we looked at, could we remove that, and could we recreate the revenue from that by creating our own experience at the bottom of the page? So recirculating to our own articles, but taking a personalization algorithm into account that we built ourselves, and using our own advertising stack, but then only loading those ads when we're pretty sure that the reader is going to get to that part of the page. So we're not degrading the value of the page, or degrading the viewability, or executing too much ad load in JavaScript. So that was a really transformative thing for the Sun. That had a major impact. So we increased the recirculation to our own articles, and we significantly increased the monetization from that part of the page. And editorial team were very happy, because we didn't have those those sort of poorer quality articles that we were recirculating to. So I think that wasn't easy to do, but when we did it, it really built confidence that actually we should be taking things off and we should be trying to improve the overall experience. So we focused on really tidying things up and trying to remove as many partners as possible, and in particular reseller agreements where we didn't know who was necessarily taking a cut from the transaction, and where we couldn't trace the revenue. So we became almost sort of a little obsessive about reducing reseller lines from ads.txt file. And I think you can look at the Sun site now and compare it to other news sites or just other publisher sites generally, and you'll probably see a much cleaner file, which is a representation of that. And trying to remove ads, or certainly removing the most intrusive ads, and became very very focused on Core Web Vitals as a proxy for a good experience. So yeah, we I think we're very glad that we did that. But I don't say that or suggest that for a moment that it's easy to do that, and you have to.
No,
You get a lot of
absolutely.
resistance when you're starting to, and it's a risk, right? You're taking this stuff off, and you feel that the revenue is going to drop, but typically it doesn't. The ad unit value increases if you experiment cautiously.
And that's fantastic to me. Hearing you actually did the opposite of what most of the industry is doing. So you remove the external content recommendation, you increase content circulation, you reduce the ad load, you clean up the ad presence on the page, and you dynamically adjust it so that it will optimize engagement. But in terms, you said the revenue doesn't drop. You might think that it will happen, but it doesn't. So can you help us in better understanding, or can you help publishers and executives listening and watching how that manifested?
Yeah, so I think you have to. What we did was look at RPM as the metric during that point. So revenue per thousand pages, and just focus on that. But within that, trying to increase the unit value of every single ad, because over time you can train DSPs and bidders to recognize quality, and quality is not pages choked up with ads. And typically it's the principle of quantitative easing. If you devalue your inventory by just flooding more and more of it into the market, then you will reduce the unit value of every ad. And we found that during that time, certainly, and it's the last 2 to 3 years, we were able to significantly increase the unit value. And again, this doesn't necessarily reflect in what you see, because it's, for example, about logic that won't allow an ad to fill if it doesn't meet a certain floor, and dynamically inserting floors at different parts of the page. So it's those sorts of experiments, like having a revenue operations and a commercial technology team that's able to experiment and able to think freely, but really setting them the challenge of, can you maintain or increase the value of the page whilst reducing the ad load, whilst reducing the amount of JavaScript that's being executed, whilst not filling necessarily as many ads, but increasing the ad the ad unit value. And so I think that's it, and again, that perhaps comes down to a culture of entrepreneurialism and the way that you set objectives to the team, which is really set a challenge, which is something like that, and give them the freedom to experiment to do that. And we're very fortunate. We have a very talented team, very talented revenue operations and commercial operations team who were able to do that, who were able to operate with that freedom, and they rose to every challenge.
You mentioned a keyword, which is also experimenting. So that testing and learning that allows publishers to start small and scale up if successful, which is
Yeah,
not
exactly.
always part of a strategy in media companies.
Yeah, exactly that. I think this, the ads.txt cleanup is a good place to start with this. So we, of course, you can take an ad unit off the page or something, but challenge any publisher, go and find 10% of your ads.txt file today that you think is the least valuable and cut it out and see what happens.
You mentioned earlier content recirculation. Can you help us in understanding, okay, what was the reasoning behind it? And why do you think more media owners are not taking this approach?
It's not easy to do. I mean, it's not every media owner. We're very fortunate. We had the resource. We had a data team that were able to build the models. We had a good commercial technology team that had a very high functioning ad stack. And we had to build the interchangeable tiles at the bottom of the page. So it isn't easy to do, and it's very much intrinsically woven into the technology capabilities of the business. So it's easy to say and not easy to do. You need resource to be able to do it. And you need good resource to be able to do it. So I don't for a moment imagine it's appropriate to say everybody should go and do this. That those content recommendation companies serve a purpose to many publishers and good partners to many publishers. So I don't wish to detract from that. When we did it, the experience we had was also one where, if we're honest, we were perhaps a bit nervous going into it, and we'd said, well, we'll start with 10% or pick a section, and then we'll increase it from there. And we'd modeled it to suggest that, well, if we just break even, then that would be a good outcome. If we could replace the revenue and break even in terms of recirculation, then it would be worth it, because we would have freedom and to experiment over the entire page, and we would have control over that entire page.
100%.
And so we started with 10%, and then the results were better than we'd expected, and nervousness started to fade pretty quickly. And then it was a question of how quickly can we do this? We're going to make more money. We're making more money on the 10%. Let's go to 20. Let's go 30. Just turn it on.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. So then it was a case of, yeah, this is great. Let's move as quickly as we can. But I would be lying to you if I said that we went into it thinking this is going to, this is definitely going to work. There's definitely butterflies going in.
Sure, but in between the lines, I must say there is also this interesting approach, which is a very effective approach. Is not, and I tell media owners in general often, it's not that you need to change overnight, switch something on and turn the other off. Suddenly, the world will change. You had a phased approach. And that's another important element to it, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. But most of the things we're doing are fine tuning, aren't they? And then there are some of these bigger things that come around every so often that really make a material difference, but they're few and far between. If we knew what they were, we'd all be doing them. But so yeah, that was a big one for us. But it's again, it's not easy to do unless you have the resource to do it.
Sure. Moving to data, there is no data today without consent. And as I've been saying for a long time, consent is the new oil. So everything starts with it. You have made the news with the role of head of consent, which I think summarizes perfectly the approach and what consent means for a data and audience strategy. How did it come to life?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, consent is one of those things that is often overlooked, or it sort of falls between the cracks of a publishing organization. I mean, the value of it is just undoubted. I think it doesn't take many percentage points a reduction in consent levels before you can run into the tens of millions in revenue. So it really is. It's a metric that is directly correlated to revenue. And I think you look around publishing organizations and say who owns it, and it probably sits under a DPO, and there's a legal function, and then there's a revenue operations or commercial technology function, maybe manages the CMP relationships. And often the strategies around consent don't have a clear home. It's now sort of far more important than that. And I think consent rates and bounce rates for consent are something that we should be looked at. But the we anticipated this being the case, and I think we've seen some good examples recently. I mean, obviously the ICO wrote to the top 100, and I think now it's maybe extended to more publishers just before Christmas and said you need to put the change to the consent banner in place to have reject and accept in equal measure, which many publishers weren't doing. And so, that really brought that into sharp focus, the need for consent and decisions around whether to adopt consent or pay or how to approach that model. And so, that's a really big area of focus and something that publishers have to really look at and think about, what's happened before in France, in Germany and Austria. And so, it's an increasingly important metric. 75% of the world, I think, are now under some form of privacy regulation relating to consumer data, and I expect the rest of the world will follow at some point. I think it was actually talking about consent. It's quite interesting. So Google's rather terse note to the industry this week. The only thing you could really pick out of that, there's very little certainty in it, but it was interesting that the one thing that was of relevance was this, point about elevated consumer choice. So another reference to consent, and let's see how that manifests. Let's see where that goes. But it's another example. That at some point the user is going to be presented with some form of consent choice, however complex or well hidden that may be. We'll have to wait and see. But it just goes to show that if all else fails, consent is the one thing that is a constant now.
But would you agree that the approach to consent is a marathon, is not a sprint? It's about building trust. It's about taking the user through a journey. How do we make it better in the industry? Well, I mean, if someone asked me the question, I would say, look at News UK, head of consent, a holistic approach. What would you suggest to smaller media companies?
You mean what in terms of their approach?
In terms of how to approach consent, because people assume that is just putting a box out there and the user will say no, will say yes. I'm saying you need to communicate the value exchange.
Yeah, it does. It requires really careful consideration. I think if you think about consent, it doesn't. What is consent actually for? And there are so many applications for consent, or so many things start with consent that it runs far beyond commercial. And commercial, the economics of publishing have been built largely on non-consented users over I mean, this has changed in the last 5, 6, 7 years, but before that, so much of the industry was built without consent, and that was the world in which we operated. Those were the economics that we operated in, and now consent is the starting point for ad monetization, for marketing purposes, for campaign measurements, for surveys, for emails, e-commerce attribution,
subscriptions.
Exactly. Product editorial, the experimentation, social media embeds within articles, content curation, understanding user journeys. The list goes on. So you really can't underestimate the value and the importance of gathering consent. And so I think for any smaller organization, I think, as you said, you can't see it as a binary choice within a box. You have to think of it as a very considered and crucial part of your business model. And so from that, certainly the way that it's explained, I think is really important. And like you say, the value exchange, you see different publishers approaching it in different ways. And I think that depends on the relationship you have with the audience, how they've arrived at the site. And yeah, the strength of the bond between the consumer and the brand, and all of that will dictate the tone as to how you go about how you approach asking for consent. So I don't think there's a single best practice approach here, but I also think as we start to see consent or pay models come in, and the blending of subscription models and membership models with payment for not consenting, I really encourage looking at the way European publishers have dealt with that approach, certainly in France, in Germany and Austria, who've been there for some years, and also have worked very closely with the regulators to define what the best approach is. I mean, consent or pay is a pretty clunky experience, and it's hard to understand for most consumers.
I'm
Particularly
totally against it.
if you are you, I'm not totally against it, but I don't think it's a good experience. But then that it's adhering to what the regulators have asked for in some respects. And I suppose the case for it is it's the clearest way of explaining the value exchange that the open internet relies on advertising or paying. You know, the whole if you're what's the thing if you're not if you don't know if you're not paying, you are the product or whatever.
Yes.
It's the clearest way of explaining that to the consumer, but certainly the journey by which you get there is far from clear, especially if you're then layering in a membership model. And you see that in certain implementations in France and Germany, where they'll say, you know, this is not the premium thing, this is just paying not to be tracked. And it's bewildering, and bewildering even for people who do understand this and work in the industry, let alone the normal consumer.
Yes, and the reason why I'm saying that I'm totally against it, because I think I understand the reasons behind it, but I also think that it's a shortcut. So it's you didn't communicate the value exchange before. You didn't have, and that's why I love the idea of a head of consent. So you didn't have a long-term strategy on consent, and now you are going in with a bland approach, which also doesn't somehow, in my opinion, devalues trust. So trust is not anymore a differentiator, because even MFAs can put a consent or pay. And as I wrote, an MFA can say, okay, I make the pay button not to work, and I will then very easily have all consented users.
Yeah, well, suffice to say that, you know, consent is overlooked, and I think having somebody who lives and breathes that is crucial, who really understands the legal ramifications, who can you know, liaise and work with industry bodies and regulators, can lobby on behalf of publishers, can own the CMP, and the same spirit of experimentation, of understanding how we communicate with the users, and build a you know, deliberate approach to consent. And I think related to that, it's you know, consent and identity obviously very closely related, but thinking of the incentives that you offer as a publisher to make clear the value exchange beyond just the consumption of content, and thinking about a structured approach to identity, and understanding, you know, how you can collect different levels of identifier, and the fidelity of those identifiers based on the clarity and understanding of the value exchange between publishers. So having a very deliberate approach to that, and using consent as a lens by which to look at that identity strategy.
And I would like to close this conversation with one last fundamental pillar, which is collaboration, alignment across different teams, entities, even countries in your case.
Yeah, well, News Corp is a very federated company. You know, it has very different businesses, and certainly when you look at it internationally, they operate quite separately, and the company has always been structured that way. But there are certain areas where commonality is of real benefit, and clearly, you know, like data structure is one of those, data taxonomies and schema, and so often if we're allowed to do things differently, then we will, and we'll end up doing the same things, but calling them by slightly different names, and rebuilding the same things. So there are some areas where we've really identified a need for effective collaboration. So we work across all of the News Corp business units on those very specific areas. And, you know, there are lots of aspects of commercial and advertising technology where consistency is appropriate. Now, clearly there are market nuances and relationships with buyers and different ad tech choices in certain markets that need to be respected. But the principles are really consistent. And I give one example, which was you talked earlier about the reduction of ads and ad load. And that's something we started talking about with our colleagues across the globe, and it's something that we all agreed on in principle. So we came up with a set of values across News Corp and started to share ways that we were adhering to those values, which are many of the things we've discussed and in the change that we would like to see in the wider industry. So that became a focus for us. And so, so I think we need to try and strike that balance of autonomy and strategic autonomy for the brands, but identifying where it makes sense to collaborate, coming up with ideas that can be made portable. So, and the one that we're focused on now, and I think is the basis for so much innovation, is alignment in terms of data schema and taxonomy, which is a fuel for so many different parts of a publisher's business.
How can you make sure, though, that the incentives also are aligned? Because it's nice to talk about collaboration, it's nice to talk about alignment, but if the incentives are not pushing towards that, it's very hard.
Yeah. And you don't have that. So in a federated business, it's even more complicated if you take Ozone into account, where you need to incentivize publishers who are competitors to work together and certainly aren't going to get on a call and share the way that they do things. And I think that's in the way that you design governance around those things. So you need to make it optional to participate, but clearly create enough value in participation that there's a desire to do it. And so there is no way to force participation in even in a federated company like News Corp, and certainly not in a joint venture between competing publishers. But in both cases, that works where the incentives are designed, and the only way to do that is to make the value from collaboration strong enough. And so I think that comes from designing governance and having leaders in place that are aware of that and recognize the need to work with the group to create the incentives, which ultimately has to come in the form of some business benefit or commercial upside for participating in the shared initiative or joint venture if it's publishers in different organizations. We've been able to do that, but it's not something I would suggest is particularly easy to do.
Thank you, Ben. It's not easy. That's the key word for me. It's not easy. Success doesn't come easy. We have, as an industry, we're being used for too long to have an easy path, or at least to be sold the easy way.
Well, yeah, and I think this is an interesting point. Is that for so long the foundation on which the publishing industry was built was relatively stable. Like we could argue it wasn't equitable because we had social platforms, we had search, which you could rely on and was relatively stable. And what we've seen in the last really 3 years in particular, and maybe a bit before that, is instability starting to creep in from things that we've once felt were perhaps inequitable but stable, and that created a degree of certainty. And so now we're having to navigate equivocation and change in a way that we haven't been actually that used to. And so that requires a bravery in thinking. It's probably why I keep saying it's not easy, because it requires us to think in new ways and to collaborate in new ways and to approach our businesses in different ways. And largely that's come because of the technological advances that we've seen in the last 2-3 years have started to shake the foundations of the industry that we knew as stable, even though we didn't love them. And so, yes, I think you're right to suggest it's not easy, but that's what makes it interesting, right? Is that's these massive.
I couldn't agree more.
Them, right?
It would be boring otherwise. Thank you, Ben. It's been really interesting. You covered so many of my favorite topics. We'll have you hopefully back soon, and we'll hear more about your journey.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. It's been a pleasure. Always good to talk to you. And thank you for having me.